Greetings, peoples of the internets. It's another video from us. Today I'm doing something a little bit different. So, if you can, guess what I'm on about today. I know that the new Star Wars movie is dropping next month, supposedly, if you listen to internet rumors. They're still not done with it. And I never really got in on the bit about trashing the last movies and going on with what was wrong with those. So I figured, before the next one drops, I'd like to throw in my 2 cents, especially considering that nugget of an interview that Kathleen Kennedy gave this last week as I'm recording this, saying that these movies were hard to do because Star Wars had no source material. Regardless of the fact that there's a video of her sitting next to George Lucas as he's telling everybody about all the books and the comic books and the drafts that he's got that he's going to give to her so she can make Star Wars. Nah, she's got no source material. If you ever need an example of somebody who should not be in charge of what they're in charge in, that's it. That woman should not be in charge of Star Wars. I'm sure she's good at something, but it's not Star Wars. But I'm not going to get onto that rant. This is a different rant. I'm going to tell you today what I think is wrong with the Disney Star Wars movies. And it's not what you see a lot of the time. Now, there have been a lot of YouTube channels going on about various things that are wrong in the movie. And there's plenty wrong in the movie. And I'm strictly going to speak to the numbered episodes, number 7 and number 8. To be honest, I actually kind of liked Rogue One, and Solo was about a 5.5, 6 out of 10 movie if you took it on its own. Once you tie it into the rest of the lore and find out that, spoilers if you haven't seen it, that Han Solo is just a lying schlub whose ship has an AI that does all the flying for him, so he's not even a good pilot. Yeah, if you don't connect it to the rest of the lore, it's a half-decent movie. Once you connect it to everything else and it ruins, another of the original trilogy characters, it's just not that good. But I'm going to stick to the numbered episodes for this little rant. So anyway, a couple of specific videos I'd like to call out because I really enjoyed the points that they brought up and then bothered to support. So there's a channel called Vito that has a episode called The Last Jedi, A Complete Cinematic Failure, where he does a pretty good job of breaking down the failures in the writing and the plot and the acting and pretty much the entire movie. Another good one is Robot Head has an episode called Disney Doesn't Understand Lightsabers, which is more strictly about the throne room fight scene, which is painful to watch. I did martial arts in high school and college, so I do actually know something about fighting with weapons, swords and stabs, and that scene is painful. Another one, if you want to get really pedantic, it's a channel called Smutboy. Has a playlist called X number of problems with Star Wars The Last Jedi you might have missed in X number of minutes, where he goes through and he'll take 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever of a movie, or this one in particular, and basically tell you almost in real time everything they're doing that's dumb and or wrong. And trust me, he's got a lot of material to work with here. I think this playtime for this playlist is actually a lot longer than the runtime of the movie he's making fun of. And another one for the people who, know something about actual weapons play, a channel called Shadiversity. He does a lot of good medieval weaponry type stuff, if you're into that. He's got a little series called Fight Scene Autopsy. The first one is the Last Jedi Throne Room. And he tears that apart. So, if you like watching that kind of thing, go look those guys up. They're pretty good. Anyway, so what do I think is wrong with Disney Star Wars? I'm sure you've heard of the Uncanny Valley. Normally, this is associated with CGing either people, live replacements, most specifically to their face. The human brain is hardwired to recognize faces and motion because that's how you interface with reality. You talk to people, you have to recognize them face to face, and you see things moving, so it tracks your eye to it. 2 things that your brain is by its very evolutionary structure designed to pay attention to. The uncanny valley does not always just apply to faces. It also applies to underlying rules. What do I mean by that? So, if you've ever seen a badly CG'd or animated scene where, a perfect one right off the top of my head is the fight scene from, I believe it's Matrix Reloaded, where Neo is fighting the herd of Agent Smiths and he's like in a basketball courtyard or something. There are several parts in the scene where he one in particular where he jumps up holding out a stick and spins around like helicopter top. And now granted, the scene's 15 years old or something by this point, but immediately your brain picks up that there's something wrong with that. You don't know exactly what, but you look at it and you know it's artificial. You know it's fake. And if you watch the, the Corridor channel or Corridor Crew channel, they do a lot of breakdowns on stuff like that where they tell you why your brain doesn't recognize that. A lot of it has to do with the way the skin stretches around like the mouth and the upper lip and the eyes. So if the texture mapping's not done right, it doesn't stretch right in your eyes and your brain catch that. You don't know that's what you're seeing, but your brain knows that that is not right. Another one is clothing physics. So in that particular scene where he's spinning around like a top, his clothes look like a piece of plastic. They don't move, or they move in big chunks, but there's no ripple in the wind. It looks too smooth compared to what he looks like in the scene before. Your brain picks that up. It breaks the rules of the reality that you're looking at. Now, how does this apply to Star Wars? To set this up, I'm going to go all the way back to the original trilogy. The original trilogy, now famously, George Lucas had to invent at least half of the special effects that he used in that movie to make that movie. Since he did not at the time have all the CGs and computer animations and fluid physics and, all this stuff to do green screens and whatnot, they had to create most of the effects practically, which means they had to happen in real life, which is why I think these movies sit so well with most people. Your brain understands how things work in real life. So as an example, there's a scene where Han Solo and the Falcon leave in the first movie or episode 4, from Mos Eisley at the beginning of the movie. Now, as they're leaving, the stormtroopers run in and start firing at them. Han fires back. Now, moving backwards through this scene, when Han fires back, his scout blaster, or whatever it's called, he shoots at them, he hits the wall behind them. Seeing as everything is, like I said, practical and working in real life, your brain, as a frame of reference, is applying real life physics to this situation. So when Han fires at the wall, misses, hits, like a covering or something, blows a cinder block-ish size chunk out of the wall, and the piece of the wall falls off. Well, first off, when the piece of the wall falls off, obviously it falls under normal gravity. That's a frame of reference your brain understands. Normal physics. So that means if this is a stone wall, he's hitting it with enough heat and or power to blow a chunk out of it. Whereas immediately before that, when the stormtroopers come in and started blasting, when their bolts hit the wall, it's leaving little pock marks in it and little burn marks. So your brain can immediately build a frame of reference. You've got Han's blaster blowing hand to small brick-sized chunks out of a stone wall, and you got stormtrooper blasters blowing little quarter-sized divots in the wall and leaving burn marks. Your brain can immediately make that association. Now, this being, the late 70s to early 80s for the original trilogy, things like astrophysics and quantum science were not things that people talked about on a day-to-day basis. So there was a lot of stuff that was either ad-libbed or flubbed or just thrown out of their seat of the pants that didn't make a whole lot of sense. That wound up getting actually retconned a lot of the time to make sense in a different way. Two things specifically, both from Han Solo, strangely enough. One, that he made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs, which everybody made fun of that forever because parsecs is a unit of distance. Which they retconned that to mean that he figured out a way to make the run actually shorter than other people so he could get there faster. They actually used the plot line badly, but they used it in the Solo movie, so hey, it's canon. Another one was when he said the Millennium Falcon flew zero point 0.5 past the speed of light. Well, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because since we're working with somewhat real life physics here, you got Earth. Our next closest space neighbor is Alpha Centauri, I believe. At least that's what it was when I was in college. So, and they know that between these two is 27 light years. That means at the speed of light, it's going to take 27 years to get there. It's a hell of a road trip. Ah, but he can move 0.5 past the speed of light. Well, that means he moves at 150%. So take 25% off of that. So 27 years. Let's make it 28, just because that's an easier number to do the math with. 28 divided by 4 would be 7. So give or say it take give or take 28 years at the speed of light to make that trip. If you take 7 years off of it, it's still 21 years. A newborn baby would be legal drinking age by the time you made it there. That's not a fast trip. That is definitely not the speeds we see them making interplanetary distances in the Star Wars movies, where they're flying from planet to planet in a matter of hours. Sometimes it seems like minutes, depending on the editing. So that was another one that got retconned by some fans that I guess apparently became canon at some point, where they took that to mean it was a 0.5 class hyperdrive, which is a whole nother math thing that I'm not going to get into. But hey, it's a thing that came up, it's canon, and they use that to explain the speed of ships in the Star Wars universe. So that real life practical effects of the original trilogy, not to mention, like good storytelling and character development, made the original trilogy it made it what it is, obviously. So moving on to the prequel trilogy, I actually liked 2 of the 3 prequel movies. Attack of the Clones was a terrible movie, just except for the Obi-Wan on Kamino scenes and the fight on Geonosis. The rest of the movie wasn't worth watching. It was painful. But if you look at the overall story of the prequels, it was actually a really good story. Now, the biggest problem the prequels had was the hype. When Phantom Menace came out, it was the first Star Wars movie in 16 years. People that had seen the last one as small children were now high school and college students and had their own money and can go out and see it, and they were ready for it. Oh, it was going to be hard to live up to the hype. This movie had to do, instead of just telling a story like the original trilogy did, the original trilogy did most of its world building as an aside. You learned about, the Empire and the Rebellion because people talked about it like while they were running from blaster fire. There was no long drawn out exposition. Stuff was just kind of offhandedly explained. Well, now you're going back to the prequels, which were the setup for the movies that you've already seen. So all of these things that had been mentioned, had been, said that they were, such a big thing that happened in the past, they all now have to be fleshed out. They have to be explained. You had to explain the Jedi Order, which means you had to explain the Senate and the corruption therein. You had to explain how the Sith came back. And in the middle of all that, you also had to tell a story that was the setup for the original trilogy, but also relevant to the here and now in the story you're setting up. That movie specifically, The Phantom Menace, had like 5 jobs it had to do. That's not easy. It's easy to set something up for the first time. It's not easy to go back and flesh out something that somebody else has already mentioned. Anyway, prequel trilogy, as I said, the first one and the last one were relatively good. Nobody really liked Attack of the Clones. But why didn't Attack of the Clones get all the hate that The Last Jedi does? Because everybody agreed that both of them were bad movies. Possibly because when Attack of the Clones came out and everybody said this one kind of sucks, George Lucas did not come out and insult all his fans and call them, misogynist, woman-hating basement trolls. Yeah, insulting your fans is not really a good way to convince them to keep buying your stuff. Economics 101, guys. I'm starting to wonder if anybody at Lucasfilm actually went to college or finished high school. Anyway, but what did George Lucas do? After everybody come out and said, oh, this movie was bad, the CG didn't look good, the acting was subpar, there was very little, in this movie that people liked other than the parts that I mentioned. Everybody loved Obi-Wan, and the big fight scene on Geonosis at the end was pretty cool. What did he do? He came back with Revenge of the Sith, a movie that was much better acted, even with the same actors and actresses, and containing what is possibly one of, well, it's not possibly, one of the best, if not the best, lightsaber battle in the whole series. The Anakin versus Obi-Wan fight on Mustafar was really cool. By the way, the guy I mentioned earlier, Shadiversity, he also has a fight scene Autopsy on that one. He goes through it and he gives it a pretty much glowing review. There is some dumb stuff in it done for flashiness sake, but hey, for the most part, it's got some pretty solid swordsmanship, at least theory in it. Anyway, like I said, even with the new prequels, it's a newer generation. He's got new technology. He's got more CG stuff, which he used a lot of. And to be fair, he would have had to. All the robot armies, the droid armies, and everything. There's no way you could do that practically. The hover tanks that were in the Phantom Menace, all that sort of stuff. You can't. It would have been a nightmare to do practically. It was a whole lot easier to CG a lot of that. I can understand that. I don't hold that against the movie. The CG may not stand up against the test of time, but at the time it was really good. For the most part, even with that CG, things were done so that it worked fairly well. When things swam, they looked like they were swimming. Obviously, you had the few oddball scenes where you see people using force powers, like force jumping off of stuff, and they either jump up or fall down too fast, and you kind of notice it, but you can kind of write it off as okay, weird force powers that we don't really have a frame of reference for. That's where your suspension of disbelief comes in a little bit. That's there to make watching movies better. But for the most part, interactions between characters, even CG characters, were fairly believable. The only things I really had a problem with were in Revenge of the Sith, and near the end, there was a lot of sketchy timeline, where it looked like people were going from like planet to planet in the span of minutes, like during a fight scene. And honestly, I put that down more to editing than anything else, but you start to notice like, hey, this timeline's moving real fast. But like I said, that's more an editing thing. It wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible. Now, on to Disney and the problems therein. So now that I'm however many minutes into this little mini rant, I'm actually going to change up my background on the other one for you here. This is the Star Wars Galaxy map. This is going to help me explain part of my problems with Disney Star Wars. So like I said, in the other two, starting with the original trilogy and then the prequel trilogy, a lot of the interactions between people and objects work with relatively real life physics because most of it was done practically. This is where Disney's starts to go wrong. They start doing a lot of stuff either completely CG or video effects into ridiculousness. They also apparently didn't bother to get a science consultant of any sort, or college student, or even high school student, to look at some of these things they've got in here. So I'm going to start with 7, The Force Awakens. One of my biggest problems, and don't get me wrong, at first glance, first time I watched this movie, I just kind of liked it. I realized that there was a whole lot of homage to, A New Hope in it, and there was a lot of recycled ideas, Starkiller Base. A lot of my problem with this movie was Starkiller Base. Don't get me wrong, I understand, bigger is better, it worked before, let's do it again kind of thing. But, there's so much wrong with Starkiller Base. First problem, how did it get there? Nothing in the movie says that it had a propulsion system. If it had no way of moving, then it had to be built in place. So how did they do it? There's two basic ways you could have built Starkiller Base, and both of them don't work. One, you take a planet that's already there, you cut it in half, you hollow it out, and you build your superstructure with your giant planet-killing ray gun in the middle of it. Well, that doesn't work because if you cut a planet in half and start hollowing it out, you destroy its local gravity well, which means that all the atmosphere on the planet, the atmosphere that the guys on the base on the planet had to have to be able to breathe, and the guys that were, walking around in the snow on the outside of the planet had to have to be able to breathe. Yeah, when you disrupt the gravity well of the planet, all the atmosphere goes poof, and now you're open to vacuum. That doesn't work. Also, if you do actually manage to core the planet out, you've lessened its mass, which means that its path around its star will change. Since it has less mass, it's going to start spiraling in toward the star until it just swirlies right into it and becomes star fuel. That's not good. That don't work. The other possibility is that there was no planet there, and they built the superstructure and then either destroyed or found a destroyed planet to bring large chunks of planet matter, mountain ranges and with trees and snow and everything, and put them on top of the superstructure. Still doesn't explain how they still had atmosphere to run around on the surface of the planet, and how they had growing trees and an ecosystem since it was snowing in places, and it doesn't work. On top of that, said large planet-killing laser in the middle of the planet. Even if they could science away recoil, which I would love to see what the recoil on a planet-destroying, planet-mounted weapon would be, but they fired it from inside the atmosphere. You can tell that because you can see in the movie that the snow moves back and there's a shock wave. And if you fired something like that from the atmosphere of a planet at another planet, you would set the atmosphere of the planet you were on fire. Best case scenario, the shock wave from the localized damage of destroying the local atmosphere would be like huge nuclear bombs going off. So if their base was anywhere near the barrel of that weapon, which it had to have been because they could see the energy being leaving the planet, the shockwave from it probably would have killed them. So that doesn't make any sense either. Oh, and speaking of the giant planet-killing space laser that's built into the planet, it recharges itself from its local sun. Now, they don't specify whether it does something like just somehow absorbing the energy from the star, or if it's actually sucking star matter through space into the gun to recharge it, which is kind of what they show on screen when you're watching it, regardless of the fact that stars have far, far greater gravity wells than planets do, because the stars are the ones that hold the planets in orbit. So that space matter, or that star matter, is far heavier than the matter on the planet. So it's also far bigger than the planet. So somehow the gun only manages to get 2 shots off of a star that's several hundred times the size of the planet. It doesn't make sense. Not to mention the fact that if they are pulling flaming nuclear star matter through the atmosphere of the planet they're on, which should also ignite the atmosphere and kill everybody on the planet, Starkiller Base just doesn't work in any logical sense. And since I keep bringing up the atmosphere on that planet, Starkiller Base has a shield that stops anything moving less than the speed of light. So Han Solo's great plan is to fly the Millennium Falcon into the atmosphere of the planet, moving at the speed of light. Yeah. And somehow this plan does not turn them all into chunky salsa when the ship hits the atmosphere. Have you ever, thrown a rock at a puddle or a pond or something? Flies great through the air. As soon as it hits the water, kabloop, there's this big splash. Yeah, that happens when things hits the atmosphere. And if you're moving in to what is basically a fluid, because air is actually considered a fluid for it's the dynamics of how it moves, something that is basically a metal single-story house slamming into the atmosphere of a planet, moving at 186,000 miles per second or faster. Yeah, the ship should have exploded. They should have all turned into chunky salsa slamming into the nearest wall. The drag and the heat, because you've all seen shooting stars and stuff hitting the atmosphere, I'm assuming. That flame trail, yeah, that's from them moving at, 10, 15,000 miles an hour. Try hitting the atmosphere a factor of 10 times that or more. they would have just been a giant fireball if it didn't, again, ignite the entire atmosphere of the planet, which is entirely possible when you're getting into that level of impact. So, in addition to not understanding how gravity or basic astrophysics or nuclear fusion material work, they obviously also do not understand how faster than light works, or at least how momentum and inertia do. So I'll point out a little later on, but in canon rules, Einsteinian physics, or normal day-to-day physics, do affect things in hyperspace, or faster than light. So, to quote the great Han Solo, I'm going to bring up a quick quote.
Without precise calculations, we'd fly right through a star or bounce too close to a supernova and then it end your trip real quick, wouldn't you?
So, without precise calculations, you'd fly right through a star or too close to a supernova. So that means that you can hit things, so mass affects things in hyperspace. Ergo, gravity will affect things in hyperspace, which is why interdictors and things with gravity fields can pull ships out of hyperspace in canon. Or too close to a supernova, which could, again, either be the gravity well or it could be the heat from the supernova just cooking them in transit. Why do I bring this up is another problem? Especially in 7, there are several times where people appear to just be waiting in hyperspace. They're like just traveling in hyperspace, waiting to be told that the shields are down on Starkiller Base, and then they drop out and they're right there. That's not how momentum works. If normal physics affects things in hyperspace, now assuming that they have some sort of sci-fi tech way of ablating inertial change, which would just be them speeding up or slowing down to hyperspace should kill them from the acceleration or deceleration. Assuming they figured out a way around that, since they've had faster than light travel for like 25,000 years, according to the Star Wars lore, you can't come down to even sublight speed, interplanetary sublight speeds, and turn. You can't just slow down and hang a hard left. It doesn't work. Mainly because even if they figured out a way to keep you from imploding during the turn, the ship structure would not survive the turn. There's a story. You can find somebody talking about it on YouTube. But back in the days when they were testing the SR-71, I believe, according to the story, they were testing the afterburners, or the top speed of the ship one way or another, which was something like Mach 3-ish, 3.3-ish, something like that. The way the story goes is he's in flight and he's running for speed, and he gets a call to return to base. So he has to cut a U-turn and fly back. Due to the speed he was going, to avoid damaging both himself and the ship, the U-turn that he made took 3 states. 3 states to make a U-turn to go back to where he came from. That's at Mach 3-ish. I'm not exactly sure what speed he was going. Now, if you're moving at speeds where you can probably move in between planets in a system within a few hours, you are moving really fast. So if you dropped out of hyperspace to interplanetary sublight speed and tried to make like a 90-degree turn, because if you were just sitting in hyperspace, you'd have to be circling. You just have to be making a big circle and waiting. Then you'd have to drop out, and then you'd have to turn to come into your target. No, it wouldn't work the way they show it. The way they show it in the movie, it looks like, oh, I get the thing, let's drop out of hyperspace. Boom, I'm right here at the planet. And those problems are basically all science. I'm not even going to get onto Mary Ray Sue or Emo Ren. But now let's get to the problem at hand. The crux of the matter. The shiny turd that was The Last Jedi. There are quite a few videos out there where people talk about things that are wrong with the movie. And there's a lot wrong with the movie. Bad writing, bad acting, nonsensical plots. Yeah, there's a lot wrong with this movie. This movie seems to understand FTL, faster than light, even less than 7 did, if that's possible. One of the main plot of the movie is a long, boring chase scene where they can't jump to hyperspace because they're being tracked. So they're just driving along, staying ahead of the bad guys. During this chase scene, other people make hyperspace jumps to other places and come back. Well, if other people can leave and come back while they're making this change, why didn't the First Order just call for reinforcements to come from the other side and box them in? It makes no sense. Neither one of the militaries, the First Order or the Resistance, in The Last Jedi seem to know how to military. They had got no strategy to them at all. Why was Canto Bight even a thing? That was just a wasted 15 minutes of movie. And how does Rose Tico not understand that you win battles by beating the other guy? But I'm not going to get into all that because that has been vastly covered by pretty much everybody on YouTube. I'm going to throw out a few unpopular opinions. There were some things about The Last Jedi that I didn't have as much issue with as everybody else. Mainly because of the fact that they're somewhat easily explainable. So, what did people get all aflutter about with The Last Jedi? Let's go with the first one on my list here. Bombs. Okay, yeah, the bomber scene was dumb. That was movie flash for Rian Johnson because he wanted a bomber scene. Okay, artistic license. I won't even get into that. But so many people are hung up on the fact that the bombs, how did the bombs get to the other people in space because there's no gravity? There is gravity in space, especially when you're over a planet. You know, planetary gravity does not stop at the planet. It goes out past the moons. That's why the moons are in orbit around the planet. Granted, they wouldn't necessarily fall fast, but it's there. If the target is between you and the planet, then gravity would move the bombs in that direction. The ships also have their own gravity wells because they generate gravity so people can walk around. That would naturally attract things toward the ship if they get close enough. Even that is just the physics part of it. Militaries around the world had missiles that could hit the window in a building from hundreds of miles away back in the 90s. And you guys are gonna, complain that super advanced, galactic level civilizations that have had faster than light travel for 25,000 years can't figure out self-propelled target tracking bombs? Come on, that's too easy. That should have never even been a thing. Number two, as what's his name? The guy from Geeks and Gamers, Jeremy, calls him Jake Skywalker. So, with no explanation, Luke Skywalker in that movie makes no sense. That is not the Luke Skywalker that we were, brought up to imagine from the original trilogy. The guy with the eternal hope who can bring back Darth Vader to the light side, and all that jazz. You can change characters, but you have to provide explanation. Now, my dad, my granddad, were both in the military. So is my uncle. So in my day, I've met a lot of military people. And to be honest, Luke Skywalker from this movie reminds me of every old, jaded, retired NCO who retired out of the military and then wanted to move to the middle of BFE and not have to deal with people ever again. Whether they wanted to move to a cabin in Alaska or, some mountain log home in, Tennessee mountains, or he reminds me of that. But you have to explain that. If there had been some explanation of, maybe after The Last Jedi, he got married, he had a kid, maybe his wife died during a Jedi mission or something, and then the kid, I don't know, caught a disease and died or something, and then you get to, the betrayal of Emo Ren and the destruction of his school, and, you can build that up to the point where, like, okay, no more, I can't take it, I'm out. And now you've explained, crusty old grumpy hermit Luke living on an island out, in a planet in the middle of nowhere. But you can't just go from Return of the Jedi Luke to grumpy old hermit Luke. There's too big of a disconnect if you don't explain that transition. It's called character building. I'm not sure anybody there knows what that is. Anyway, next on the list of things that people had problems with that I can solve with basic physics. Leia Poppins. Okay, so one of the first on-scene or on-screen Jedi powers that we get to see is the Force pull or Force push. I believe you first see it in the beginning of Empire, because I know Luke does the little Force pull to get his lightsaber out of the ice in the Wampa Cave. And again, later on fighting Darth Vader uses the Force push to throw stuff at him. So if we didn't see it in A New Hope, we did see it in Empire. So it's been around for a while. It's a firmly established Force ability. So seeing as she was just on a ship and got blown into space, you could, and I will admit it is a stretch, you could argue that she used the Force pull to pull enough of the evacuated atmosphere around her to create an air bubble. Even if she didn't, there's a great video on the Because Science channel where the guy on there explains that even though space is really cold, it would actually take you a while to freeze in space because there's no air to pull the heat away from you. So the heat would bleed off of you really slowly. Now, you would eventually turn into an icicle because it's like 3 degrees Kelvin or something in space. But without an atmosphere to move that heat away from you, you're actually fairly insulated. You would suffocate before you freeze to death, which means on average you have between 2 to 5 minutes to do something before you start causing brain damage from lack of oxygen, give or take. Force pull, easy power, or at least well-documented power. Einstein's third law, equal and opposite reaction. So you have a 70-ish, maybe, kilogram Leia floating out in space, and you have a multi-million metric ton spaceship. Tens of metric tons, if not hundreds of metric tons of metal floating in space. Now, yes, they're in space, so weight works differently depending on how much gravity is around them. Mass, however, does not change. If Leia does a force pull against the space cruiser, and you apply that force equally to puller and pull E with no gravity well around them, the lighter of the two, which would be Leia, would wind up pulling herself toward the ship instead of the ship toward her, which would cause it to look like she was Mary Poppinsing toward the ship. I actually don't have a problem with that. It's explainable with simple physics. It's dumb, not the movie choice I would have really gone with, or at least not how I would have depicted it, and I'm not sure at any point they ever claimed that Luke trained Leia in any force abilities, but we can assume that there was a gap of time in between the movies. Stuff like that can happen. I can forgive that. It's a relatively simple explanation. I don't know why people got so bent out of shape other than it just looks stupid. And my final point on, or at least on The Last Jedi, the hyperspeed ram. People got all like, oh, that's, why has that never been done? This changes battle in Star Wars forever and blah, blah, blah. No, it doesn't. Because I can guarantee you that sometime in that 25,000 years plus of Star Wars lore history, all the way back to the Great Hyperspace Wars, somebody knew you could do that. In 25,000 years, somebody would figure it out by accident. In fact, we just heard Han a minute ago say that without precise coordinates, you could fly into a star or near a supernova and that would end your trip. So they know that you can fly ships into things at hyperspace speeds and destroy them. Why does nobody use this as a combat technique? I'll tell you why. Money, economics. So I'm going to pull up another one here real quick from The Last Jedi. Here is the hyperspeed ram. Right there. Do you see all that debris? All that shrapnel? All these chunks of this ship that are now coming out in a cone like a shotgun blast, which are now hitting these ships, which are throwing out debris like a shotgun blast. So, back to our good old Star Wars map here. You see these purple lines? Zoom in doesn't seem to work for some reason. Anyway, these purple lines are hyperspace routes. These are like the interstate highways of the galaxy. These are known routes that are clear of both gravity wells and space debris so that people can travel through the galaxy. Well, let's say you got this big one right here that goes all the way from Coruscant, which is the capital thing, around to Corellia, and then all the way down through here. So you got all these systems on this one route right here. Well, if you do this on one of those routes, that route is no longer clear of debris. In fact, there are chunks of metal anywhere from the size of a person to a house moving at a fraction of the speed of light in an expanding cone. This is a mobile minefield. And say that minefield is moving this direction. Well, somebody coming this direction that doesn't know it's there will run into it, and then they will look like this going the other direction. So now there's a mobile minefield moving this way, and you've got a ever-expanding field of junk moving like that. You've now closed a hyperspace lane. Nobody can travel through here safely. So say you did it right here just for kicks and grins on this screen. Now everybody over here has to either follow a route this way and come up, or this way and come up. Ask FedEx to have to drive through another state and see what that does to the price of your shipping. It's going to go up. Now, if you do that to a couple of them, say you do that here and here and here, this whole section of the galactic map has no easy access to anything in the core. You've cut them off. But you think, well, that's good in a war scenario, maybe. Well, maybe for the purpose of defeating something, but what do you do with it once you've won? Now, nobody that's over here in the core can get anything that might be native to this area over here because they can't get to it. And nobody that's in this area over here can get anything from the core. At least not cheaply, because they have to go all the way around, hut space and whatnot over here to get around, or all the way down, into this section to come around. You're adding many, many light years of space travel going around a blockage. That was actually one of the jobs of the interdictors, if I remember correctly. They're basically giant space scows. It's a ship with several large gravity generators on it, and they drive along and use those gravity generators to attract trash to pull them out of the space lanes. Once you have caused this, especially in a wartime scale, it's going to take years, if not decades, of many, many of these ships going back and forth through these lanes at less than the speed of light, pulling space garbage out of it. You could kind of call it a mutually assured economic destruction, because doing that would cause the economy of the entire galaxy to fluctuate. And while people like to win wars, they also like their creature comforts. You tell somebody they can no longer have, that special wine they like because you can't get to that country anymore, or, you can't have, Greek food because we can't import anything from the European Union anymore. People are going to get irate. Anyway, so this is me ranting about what's wrong with Disney Star Wars. They don't follow their own rules. That's the short version of it. They don't understand how gravity works. They don't understand how momentum and inertia works, ergo faster than light travel would work. They don't understand how character development or even plot writing seems to work. So, seeing as the new one is supposed to come out next month, I don't have high hopes for it. In a statement I never thought I would ever say, I hope this movie fails, and fails hard, so they can get the people who are screwing it up out and let somebody who knows what they're doing take charge. I mean, they have, what are those guys' names? Filoni and Favreau, the guys working on the new Mandalorian show. The Mandalorian show, the first episode of it, was a better Star Wars movie than this last Star Wars movie. Give them a trilogy. Come on, guys. Anyway, I don't plan on doing this kind of thing too often because this takes a lot of writings to keep me on point so I don't ramble and run off track. But if you guys have anything you want me to, give my opinions on and try to explain how I think the world works, maybe, I don't know. Leave a comment, let me know. I will see you guys next time around. Oh, I will leave the pages that I'm using here and some of these videos linked in the description. So look them up if you like that sort of thing.